Hello, everybody. Good morning. Today is Thursday, January 7th, and we are on day 24 of Module 2. And today we're going to continue talking about John Henry and Johnny Appleseed. We're going to be doing some comparing and contrasting about the two John Henry books today to prepare for our focusing question task. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen and get started with our video.
Authors.
Back here, Miss Sabella. What's going on? Share screen. Okay. Oh my goodness. What's going on? Okay, hold on. Okay, I'm going to try this again.
Welcome back, amazing thinkers. I'm Sue Sabella, your Great Minds teacher. Let's see what we need for today. Today you'll need your copy of John Henry, An American Legend, handout 30A, which is the Focusing Question Task 6 Evidence Organizer, your journal, and a pencil. I'll also be bringing in a copy of John Henry by Julius Lester. If you do not have a copy available by Ezra Jack Keats, no worries. I'll have enough information on my screen that will support you. Please pause here to gather what you need and just hit play when you're ready to continue. Today, we're going to take a closer look at both versions of John Henry. And we'll be taking a closer look by zooming in on two particular scenes in both of the versions. By examining the similarities, what's the same, and also the differences, what's different between the two versions, we can have a deeper understanding of authors' choices, the words that they chose, and also the illustrations that were created in each of the versions. Let's take a closer look. What does looking at similarities and differences reveal to us? When we look at similarities between two things, we're comparing. We're looking at what both things or texts have in common. When we look at differences, we're contrasting. And we're looking to see how those two things, objects, or texts are different. Let's get busy comparing, looking at similarities, and contrasting, looking at some differences. Let's begin by comparing and contrasting these two illustrations. First, let's compare. And when we compare,
Hold on one second, guys. Okay, sorry about that. Miss Couples was making our morning announcements, so I'm going to start the video now.
We're looking to see how are they the same? What is the same in both of these illustrations? Pause here to do some powerful thinking or to chat with a learning partner about the similarities. You'll be comparing these two illustrations. Just hit play when you're ready to move on.
Okay, so A few seconds, look at both illustrations and think about what are some things that you see that are the same. So some of the things that I see are the same is they're both a buffalo. Both pictures have a buffalo. Both pictures have grass. What else do you guys see? Okay, let's see what Miss Sabella says.
I'm sure you did some powerful thinking and some mighty strong chatting. And you may have had some of these ideas. When we compare these two illustrations and look at how they are similar, we can see that both illustrations are buffalo. We can also see that they have sharp hooves. And we know from our research that both live on plains, and we can see that in the illustration because the prairie grass is very high. Now it's time to do some contrasting. How are these illustrations different from each other? Pause here to do some mighty powerful thinking or some chatting with a learning partner, and just hit play when you're ready to continue.
Okay, so take a few minutes, pause the video, and then think about how are the two illustrations different. Some things that I see that are different are this buffalo is small and this buffalo is big. This buffalo is black. This buffalo is brown. What other differences do you guys see? Okay, let's see what Miss Sabella has to say.
I'm sure you looked very closely at both illustrations, and I can imagine your head and your finger going back and forth as you searched for differences. When we contrast, we have to look at illustrations more than one time. We look at objects more than one time. We really have to think powerfully. You probably noticed by contrasting the two illustrations that each illustration used a different color for the buffalo. You probably also noticed that there were different sizes. One of the buffalo was smaller than the other buffalo. And maybe, and this is something that you could infer or guess because of their sizes, that the buffalo were maybe different ages. That one buffalo may have been older than another buffalo because it was larger. Although the words compare and contrast seem like difficult words or challenging words to understand, it really helps to remember this activity. When we're comparing, we're just looking how something is similar to something else. And when we're contrasting, we're looking at how they're different from each other. Now, let's take what we just learned about comparing and contrasting to the two versions of John Henry. We've done some pretty powerful reading and thinking together about both of these texts, and we've gathered lots of our thinking in your journal. Pause here to grab your journal, and then just hit play when you're ready to continue.
Okay, so like Miss Sabella said, you do need your journal. So make sure you have your knowledge response journal. Today we're going to be on page 90. Guys, page 90. We have done so much work this year. We are almost to 100 pages of work. So make sure that you go ahead and put 90 on the bottom of today's page and put today's date on the top, which is 1-7. Okay, so put page 90 and today's date on the top. We can do our work for today.
We use story stones and story elements to look very closely at both versions of John Henry. All of the information that we gathered about those story elements can help us begin to compare and contrast these two versions. I'd like you to pause here to look at your charts for Keats' version and also for Lester's version. Take your time as you look at the two charts in your journal and consider these two questions. How are the versions the same? And how are they different? Pause here to read over your journal entries. You can also use this time to chat with a learning partner about the similarities and differences that you have in your two charts. Just hit play when you're ready to continue.
Okay, so the two charts that we did are on page 87. Okay, so we have one on page 87 that we did for the first John Henry story. And then we're on page 89 that we did yesterday for the second story. So look at those two pages as closely as you can to see what are some things that you see that are the same or similar about the two stories, and what are some things that you see that are different about the two stories. And our charts, are almost the same as Miss Sabella's, except for the one section on yesterday's where she did something different than we did. If you want to look at the charts on the screen, you can do that too, okay? But I really would like for you to look at your own chart on pages 87 and 89 and compare and contrast the two stories of John Henry. So take a few minutes, pause the video, compare your two stories, and then hit play when you're ready to continue. Hold on, I gotta share my screen again. I forgot to do that.
When you compared your two charts, you were looking for things that were the same. You probably noticed that in both versions, the story started when John Henry was born. You also probably observed that John Henry is the main character in both versions. And finally, you probably also noticed that John Henry thought he could beat the steam drill in both versions, and that he raced and won, but his heart stopped and then he died. And he did that in both versions of the text. Now let's contrast the two versions, which means we're going to look at the story elements and think about how the two versions were different from each other. I added a big red line to my journal to remind me to use language that signals to someone who's listening to me that I'm contrasting, that I'm going to be talking about the differences. Two of my favorite words to use when I'm contrasting are however or whereas. For example, I noticed in the Keats version that John Henry put out a fuse with his hammer. However, in the Lester version, he used his hammer to clear away a boulder. Pause here to use this example to try this on your own out loud. Just hit play when you're ready to continue.
Okay, so an example would be that John Henry puts the fuse out with his hammer in the Keats version of his story. However, in Lester's version, he uses the hammers to clear away a boulder. Okay, so now I want you to try doing that and then hit play when you're ready to continue. Okay, good job.
I also noticed in the Keats version that John Henry got a job on a riverboat and he repairs a broken paddle wheel. Whereas in the Lester version, there's no mention of a riverboat. Sometimes when we're contrasting, we also need to talk about or mention what's missing from a text. So even though it might not be there, it's a difference because it's not there. Thanks for working so hard to compare and contrast the two versions of John Henry using story elements. Now, let's take a look at a piece of writing that we looked at before that compares and contrasts two different texts about Johnny Appleseed. And remember, we have not read these texts. We're just looking at the paragraph to see how it's structured, how it's put together, and also we're going to look closely again at the parts of that paragraph. Because when we go to write about the two versions of John Henry, we're going to be using a similar structure, which means we're going to be using this example as an exemplar. What that means is this example can give us an idea of what your writing will look like when you compare and contrast the two versions of John Henry. One thing to make note of as we look at this complete paragraph that's all done is before we write, and you know this as a powerful thinker and an evidence gatherer, we need to gather our evidence and to organize that evidence before we write. So let's take a look at this paragraph to see what type of evidence we would need to gather from both versions of John Henry. First, let's take a look at the topic statement closely. The topic statement says, both books show how John Chapman moved west to plant a bunch of apple trees, but the versions have many differences. When I read this topic sentence, I can tell that this paragraph is going to focus on the differences between the two texts. Let's look at the 2 points to make sure that that happened, that the evidence that's in this paragraph supports the topic statement. As I read aloud the 2 points, make sure that the points are talking about the differences, that they're contrasting the two texts. Ready? Here we go. Point number 1. Aliki says Appleseed moved west after people were settled. Kellogg says he went to the new places before the pioneers. Point number 2. Also, Aliki says the Indians helped Appleseed when he was sick. In the Kellogg version, people helped him get well. Both point 1 and point 2 are discussing the differences between the two versions. Both points support the topic statement. Let's take a quick peek at the conclusion and also the introductory statement. As I read the conclusion out loud, ask yourself this question. Is the conclusion reminding the reader about the topic of this paragraph? Is it restating the topic statement? Here we go. Authors tell different versions of Johnny Appleseed's story. Did the conclusion match the topic statement? Shout it out to me or tell your learning partner. The conclusion reminds the reader what the topic statement was and what this paragraph is about. Now let's take a look at the introduction or introductory statement. Does it come at the beginning of the paragraph? It sure does. As I read the introductory statement, keep this question in mind. Is the introduction introducing us to the two authors and the name of the text? Ready? Here we go. Aliki and Stephen Kellogg tell the story of Johnny Appleseed. Shout it out to me or tell your learning partner. Did we hear the names of two authors and also the name of the text? Yes, we were introduced to Aliki, who is one author, and also Stephen Kellogg, another author. We also learned the name of the text. When I look at this paragraph, it shows us just how important it is to find the 2 points that can support our comparing and contrasting of the two versions of John Henry. So let's get started gathering some of that evidence. Pause here to take a stretch break and just hit play when you're ready to continue. In a few minutes, I'll be asking you to grab handout 30A. Before we do that, I'd like to show you how handout 30A is set up and how it can support us as we gather information for an informative paragraph. To help you see how this handout can be helpful as you create your informative paragraph, we're going to zoom in on one event. In both the Keats version and in the Leicester version of John Henry has a hammer. We're going to use this handout to look at how the authors treated that event differently in each of their versions of John Henry. Here we go. When we're gathering information for point number 1, we'll be looking at the words that the author used, the text. In the Keats version, John Henry was born with a hammer in his hand. In the Leicester version, Dad gives him 2 hammers when he leaves home, and those hammers belong to his granddaddy. That evidence came directly from both texts, both Keats' version and Leicester's version. Now let's take a look at point number 2. Point number 2 is made by pulling information from the illustrations in both books. You'll notice to help, I added the name Keats and Leicester at the top of each column, so that could help me keep my thinking organized. When we look at the illustration in the Keats version, when John Henry gets his hammer, we notice that the baby is smiling with a hammer in his hand. The colors are bright and happy on that page. When we look at the Leicester version, we notice that John Henry is older and grown when he gets his hammers. He's given 2 hammers. We can see them on one shoulder. On the page, the colors are dark, and John Henry looks serious. This handout will help us organize the information as we're gathering evidence for both point 1 and point 2. What I'd like you to do now is pause here to read the introductory statement, the topic statement, and also the conclusion, and then we'll come back to review them together. Just hit play when you're ready to continue.
Okay, so the introductory statement. Keats and Lester both wrote about the legend of John Henry. The topic statement is there are differences in how John Henry got his hammer. And the conclusion is authors tell different versions of John Henry's story.
As I review the introduction, the topic statement, and the conclusion, please point to each one as we review it on the screen. The introductory statement introduces us to both authors and the name of the legend. The topic statement tells us right away that there are differences in how John Henry got his hammer, and that's what this paragraph is going to be about. And finally, the conclusion tells us that authors tell different versions of John Henry's story. Now that we have a good understanding of how this handout is organized or arranged, let's go ahead and get you set up for success. Please pause here to grab handout 30A and a pencil. If you have a copy of John Henry, An American Legend, you can also grab that now. But remember, if you don't have a copy, no worries. I'll have what we need to complete this task. Just hit play when you're ready to continue.
Okay, so you do not have a copy of handout 30A, so we are going to be doing the work in our journal, which is why we are on page 90. So we're going to just continue listening to Bella to see what to do next.
Now it's time for you to complete an evidence organizer. I'm going to be sharing information from both texts with you, but it'll be your job to gather the evidence that you need and to organize it in your organizer. Because there's a check in the corner, your classroom teacher will use this opportunity to check in with you. Be sure to take as much time as you need to complete your evidence organizer. You're going to have lots of opportunities to pause, to think, and to jot your information down in your evidence organizer. Now that you have your handout, we're going to focus in on one event so you can gather evidence for both point 1 and point 2. We're going to focus in on John Henry's death at the end of each version. Ready? Here we go. First, we'll listen to the words of Keats as he describes John Henry's death in his version. Suddenly, there was a great crash. Light steamed into the dark tunnel. John Henry had broken through. Wild cries of joy burst from the men. Still holding one of his hammers, John Henry stepped into the glowing light of a dying day. It was the last step he ever took. Even the great heart of John Henry could not bear the strain of his last task. John Henry died with his hammer in his hand. Remember, we're focusing on point number 1, and we're also focusing on the Keats version. Jot down how Keats described John Henry's death. Remember, you can always scroll back if you need to listen again. Pause here to jot, and just hit play when you're ready to continue.
Okay, so let's go back and listen to that one more time. So really pay attention to what Miss Bella is reading.
Suddenly, there was a great crash. Light steamed into the dark tunnel. John Henry had broken through. Wild cries of joy burst from the men. Still holding one of his hammers, John Henry stepped into the glowing light of a dying day. It was the last step he ever took. Even the great heart of John Henry could not bear the strain of his last task. John Henry died with his hammer in his hand. Remember, we're focusing on point number 1, and we're also focusing on the Keats version. Jot down how Keats described John Henry's death. Remember, you can always scroll back if you need to listen again. Pause here to jot and just hit play when you're ready to continue.
Okay, so we're focusing on how John Henry died. And if we look at the paragraph, what are some things that the paragraph tells us about how John Henry died?
Into the glowing light of a dying.
Sorry, forgot to fast forward it. Okay, so we are here talking about how John Henry died, and we were looking at the Keats version of how John Henry died. So, what are some things that you guys found that explain how John Henry died? Well, if I'm looking at it, I see that he stepped out into the glowing light of the day and that his heart was so strained by all of the work that this was his last task. And something important also is that he died with his hammer in his hand.
On point number 1, and we're also focusing on the Keats version. Jot down how Keats described John Henry's death. Remember, you can always scroll back if you need to listen again. Pause here to jot and just hit play when you're ready to continue.
Okay, so we are going to add this onto our chart. I know that I said we're going to be on page 90 today, but what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to write down on my chart what we talk about, and then I will post a picture for you to copy it at the end of class. Okay, we're just going to keep going.
Now, let's jot down information that's connected to the illustration on the very last page of John Henry, an American Legend. This is the illustration that was created by Keats. If you have your own copy of this text, you can open to that illustration now and use that to complete this part of your evidence organizer. If you do not have a copy, I can describe what I'm seeing. I'm seeing John Henry walking away with a hammer in his right hand, and there's a yellow light around him. Pause here to complete this part of your evidence organizer and just hit play when you're ready to move on to the Lester version.
Okay, so I'm going to show you the picture. I don't know why Miss Sabella did not show you the picture. So what are some things that you see in this picture about how John Henry died? What is he holding? Okay, what is something that we definitely need to put in our chart for that part of the story? Okay, he definitely had his hammer in his hand when he died in that part of the story also.
In a minute, I'll be pulling up an illustration and the text from the Lester version. I'll read the text aloud, but then I'm going to leave both the text and the illustration up on the screen so you can complete both point 1 and point 2 for the Lester version. Once you're done with that, you'll also complete the introduction and the conclusion. So you'll be pausing for quite a bit. Let's take a look at the Lester version. Folks were cheering and yelling, "John Henry! John Henry!" John Henry walked out of the tunnel into the sunlight, raised his arms over his head, a hammer in each hand. The rainbow slid off the mountain and around his shoulders. With a smile, John Henry's eyes closed. He slowly fell to the ground. John Henry was dead. He had hammered so hard and so fast and so long that his big heart had burst. Everybody was silent for a minute. Then came the sound of soft crying. Some said it came from the moon. Another one said she saw the sun shed a tear. As you complete the rest of your evidence organizer, remember to focus on how this version is different from the Keats version. Pause here to complete your evidence organizer, and then just hit play to finish up our video lesson.
Okay, so the first thing we need to do is talk about the topic statement. Both Keats and Lester wrote about what? What were both of these books about? Well, they were both about John Henry. So that needs to be our topic statement, that Keats and Lester both wrote about John Henry. And then our topic statement we already have is there are differences in how John Henry died. So our conclusion needs to restate that. So we can do that closer to the end. We've already done our Keats points. For our Lester points, so we know that in the Keats version, John Henry had his hammer in his hand. What about in this version? He does have his hammers, but what's different in this version about when he came out of the tunnel compared to the other version? What does he have here that he didn't have there? He's got the rainbow around his shoulders in this version, so that is one of the differences also. And in this version, we also know that it said that there was crying. And who did it say was crying? It said that some said that it came from the moon, and that another one said she saw the sun shed a tear. So in this version, it's saying that when John Henry died, the sun and the moon were crying. That's definitely something that was not in the other version. You guys think of anything else that's different about these two versions? Okay, and so our conclusion is going to just restate the topic statement. There are differences in how John Henry died. So our conclusion could be something like Keats and Lester wrote different versions of the death of John Henry, or the way that John Henry died was different in these two books. Either one of those will kind of restate topic statement. So remember, guys, I'm going to write all of this in a sample for you, and then I will post the picture, and then you are going to copy it down on pages 90 and 91 in your journal. Okay, so we've got like 2 minutes left of the video. We're going to quickly watch that, and then we'll be all finished.
You worked very hard on your evidence organizer, and we'll be using that to create your informative paragraph. So be sure to keep your evidence organizer in a safe place because we'll be using it again. I will see you again soon, my friends.
Okay, so that is the end of today's lesson. I know that was a lot of listening and a lot of watching Miss Sabella model things, but you guys did great. And make sure that you get your evidence organizer copied down on pages 90 and 91 today. And that's the only work that you'll have to do for me today for wisdom, okay? And I hope you have a great afternoon, and I will see you later. Bye, guys.